So about the will, my great-grandmother and I were very close. As I grew up, her home was always a sanctuary away from my dad and stepmother's bullshit. She was also, always, very kind to my mother, even after my mother remarried, and at one point called the police on my father. TLDR. My dad's a total narcissist, but I know how to manage him. He got heated because my mom was going to marry someone else and tried to fight about it. My mom called the police and said, "Can you get this moron off my property?" They did. The last year of my great-grandmother's life, she seemed to just deflate. My great-grandfather, her husband, had been dead for almost 12 years at this point, and I knew she missed him terribly. But that last year she seemed to talk about him more and more, and she lost a lot of weight, but never her mental acuity. One day, out of the blue, she calls my grandmother, her daughter, and asks for a ride she has to an appointment. My grandmother obliges, and great-grandmother gives her an address, to a hospice. Turns out she had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months before, and decided it was her time, rather than fighting it. She didn't tell anyone because she didn't want us to try to talk her into chemo and such when she was nearly 90. She passed very quickly after she entered the hospice, and meeting up for the funeral was the first time I'd seen my stepmother in person since I graduated from high school. I avoided her, and spent most of the time talking to my grandparents and my aunt. Even my mother came to the funeral, and I could tell she was very distraught about my great-grandmother's death. It was a lovely service in her tiny Methodist church, and then she was buried next to my great-grandfather in the nearby cemetery. My grandmother asked everyone to stay in town while she handled the will, and then we'd separate everything out. I told her I couldn't afford to, but I wasn't working at the time. Yay, mental illness. And she offered to let me stay at her house. My great-grandmother's house was locked up like a vault. My grandmother, probably in a blessed moment of foresight, hired security to watch over the house and its possessions 24 hours a day. And wouldn't you know? Every day they had to report a redhead in her mid-30s tried to go into the house, and they had to turn her away. About 3 weeks later, mostly spent with me seeing movies with my grandfather and making food for my grandmother, who never learned to cook, my grandmother called everyone together at my great-grandmother's house to handle the will. Please, friends, line the llamas up to the left, yourselves to the right, and snacks will be handed out in an orderly fashion. My grandmother decided to do a reading of the will. I am about 1000% sure this was because her own llamas were nearly starving from 3 weeks of laying low, and they desperately needed to be fed. Attorneys don't normally do readings of the will like you see in movies, so my grandmother read it, also so she could see reactions, but my great-grandmother's attorney was there with a box that was to hand out things from my great-grandmother's safety deposit box in the bank. The will was organized by generation. To my grandmother, the house and whatever remains of her possessions and money after everyone else listed has received theirs. To my great-uncle, my great-grandfather's personal effects, like his watches and cufflinks. My great-uncle basically took a huge sum of money from his parents in the 60s to go be a hippie, so there was no contention about him not getting much now. To my aunt, my great-grandmother's antique sewing machine that she'd inherited from her mother, and a lot of her vintage designer dresses. To my aunt's husband, my great-grandfather's classic car. It was some 60s Mustang or something. I am not a car person. All I know is it's apparently a good one. To my uncle, their summer home by the lake. To my uncle's wife, my great-grandparents' books except the cookbooks, and the bookshelves to keep them in. To my dad, my great-grandfather's golf clubs, pipes, and camera equipment. Get your llamas ready. To my father's wife, SM, $1 with a notation that she never forgave her for the way she treated her precious great-grandchildren, and that she will enjoy watching her burn in hell, even if it means GGM is condemned to hell herself for such vindictive thoughts. I think my grandmother was fighting off a smirk the whole time she read that. It was taking all of my self-control to keep my ass fucking silent. Thank God I had tissues so I could pretend I was crying into them while laughing silently. To my father's first wife, my mother, $250,000, plus whatever is needed to pay off her house and student loans. Y'all, my mother wasn't even at this meeting. My stepmother starts screaming, insisting that someone had tampered with the will. She's not family. My grandmother deadass looks at her with that 1,000-yard stare and said, "Neither are you." My dad is beet red, but my grandmother has always been able to at least keep him quiet. After a few minutes of yelling, my grandmother told her to sit down and shut up. They weren't done. To my great-uncle's son, my great-grandfather's boys' cabin and all the contents, mostly hunting equipment and outdoor sporting stuff. To my aunt's children, a trust fund to pay for college, each. To my uncle's stepson, who he always treated like his own son, a trust fund to pay for college. To my younger sister, SM's only bio kid, a trust fund to pay for college. To my younger brother, my only full sibling, $250,000 and an heirloom necklace to give to his wife if he ever marries. He since has, and it looks lovely on her. To my younger brother, my mom's child with my stepfather, a trust fund to pay for college. To me, $250,000, her jewelry box and its contents, her cookbooks and the contents of her kitchen, and a letter. To my brother and I's children, should we ever have any, a trust fund to pay for college. If we reach the age of 45 without children, the trust fund is to pay out our share of its remaining sum to us. Note, I don't have children yet, and my brother has two. To be honest, if I don't have children, I'll probably tell them to put the $dollar back in for my niece and nephew because I don't need the money anymore, and I don't want them to have to scale down their college dreams because I got paid. Followed by a notation that if anyone contests the will, they get nothing. So onto the letter. My grandmother looks over at me and says, "I'm sorry, I read the letter to you before I read the will. Do you mind if I read it aloud? Fam." My stepmother is already hopping mad, insisting that it's not fair. She's going to contest the will. My great-grandmother wasn't in her right mind when she wrote it, etc. My great-grandmother's attorney was right there the whole time, just rolling his eyes. I gave my grandmother the go-ahead, because about 20 years of vindication tastes like fucking fine wine. While I don't have the letter here in front of me, it's in my safety deposit box in the bank, but here's the gist of it. She is sorry she didn't tell me about the cancer, but she didn't want to worry me about something that is just a natural part of life. She is sorry that I drew the short straw when it came to parents, but is very proud of me, that my stepmother is a homewrecker and not to let her touch a cent of my money, no matter what my father says. That she hopes I'll use some of the money to get the mental health help that was denied me in childhood because my father is more concerned with his idiocy than his daughter's welfare. The rest was mostly life advice and encouragement. Sorry, I'm crying a bit writing this. I really miss her. You could have heard a pin drop in that room after my grandmother finished reading it. After a few minutes, my stepmother sputtered, "You can't let her do that." My dad just grabbed her arm and the two of them left. As soon as they were out of the door, my brother looked at me and said, "I'd high-five you, but that seems crass." And the rest of my relatives started laughing. According to my little sister, my stepmother yelled a lot about how they needed to contest the will. And finally, my father shut her up with, "I've divorced better women for less. That's enough." Which is a fucking sick burn, because my mom was his only other wife. My mom broke down in tears when we showed up with my great-grandma's attorney to handle paying off her bills and give her a fat check, and then started full-on ugly crying when they told her a trust fund had been set up for my baby brother to pay for his college. She didn't realize my great-grandmother thought so highly of her, and the money wiped out all but a few credit card bills overnight. Plus, knowing she didn't need to save for my little brother to go to college made her life so much easier. As for me, I got the mental health help I needed, and I'm still getting it. I used a significant portion of the money to pay for college once I was stable, got a nice job working from home, and used some more to move to Southern California since I have seasonal depression and not having a real winter helps a lot. Faik, my stepmother is still a bitter, spiteful bitch that knows no one likes her. My father and I have an agreement that we do not talk about her, and I do not have to ever see or speak to her or consider her existence in any way.